The arrival. The Galactic armor testing facility's reinforced walls still bore the scorch marks from KX-117's last demonstration. Massive claw marks, each deeper than a human was tall, carved patterns across duralloy plates designed to withstand capital ship weapons. In the observation deck above, military officials from 17 species whispered among themselves, their translator units struggling to keep up with the rapid exchange of amazed exclamations. The Dracovian exceeded all projected parameters, one official noted, their crystalline form flickering with patterns of deep blue appreciation. Even our most advanced defensive systems were reduced to molecular slag, finished another, this one a towering mass of synchronized nanites taking the rough shape of a humanoid. The combination of plasma generation and natural armor makes them nearly unstoppable. In the testing chamber below, KX-117 allowed himself a moment of pride. His obsidian scales gleamed under the harsh lighting, each one a masterwork of evolution refined by generations of genetic engineering. At 20 feet tall when fully upright, his species dominated any space they entered. The retractable bone blades along his forearms, currently extended to their full 8-foot length, had just finished demonstrating their ability to slice through 2 meters of compressed duralloy like it was fabric. But it wasn't just his physical capabilities that made him exceptional. KX-117 was a war leader, one of the elite few chosen to command Dracovian battle groups. His neural implants could process battlefield data faster than most AI systems, and his genetic enhancements pushed the boundaries of what even his formidable species could achieve. The facility's director, a being composed primarily of controlled plasma contained within an environmental suit, floated forward. War Leader KX-117, the results are unprecedented. Your species' natural weapons combined with the latest military augments have created something beyond our model's ability to predict. KX-117 rumbled in satisfaction, a sound that made several of the smaller officials take involuntary steps backward. The Dracovian military welcomes collaboration with the Galactic Defense Coalition. Our warriors have always been formidable. With these upgrades, we become unstoppable. The director's plasma form swirled with patterns indicating both appreciation and concern. Yes, well, about that. There is one final test series we'd like to. The message was interrupted by a priority alert that flashed across everyone's neural links. In the space around the facility, multiple ships had just emerged from hyperspace. Their energy signatures matched known pirate vessels that had been raiding the sector. KX-117's secondary heart accelerated with anticipation. A real combat test would be far more satisfying than destroying static targets. Director, with your permission, I will demonstrate these upgrades in actual combat conditions. The director's plasma form pulsed with relief. Granted. Though please try to leave at least one ship intact for questioning. KX-117 was already moving, his massive form surprisingly graceful as he headed for the launch bay where his personal combat shuttle waited. The vessel, like everything else about him, was a perfect fusion of natural ability and advanced technology. Its neural interface linked directly with his enhanced consciousness, making the ship feel like an extension of his own body. As he launched into space, his enhanced senses detected 14 enemy vessels. Most were converted cargo ships bristling with improvised weapons, but 3 appeared to be actual warships, likely stolen from various military forces. The pirates were already moving to surround the testing facility, probably assuming it was a soft target. KX-117 felt his plasma sacs warm with anticipation. They were about to learn how wrong they were. His shuttle's engines flared as he accelerated directly toward the largest concentration of enemy ships. The pirates, finally noticing the small vessel approaching, opened fire with a barrage that would have atomized most attackers. Energy beams and projectiles filled space in a deadly web. None of them touched him. His neural implants processed incoming fire patterns faster than organic brains could think, making minute-course adjustments that left enemy fire hitting empty space. The few shots that did connect were absorbed by his shuttle's shields, reverse-engineered from Dracovian scales. The pirates had just enough time to realize their mistake before KX-117 was among them. He burst from his shuttle's airlock, his massive form protected from vacuum by both natural adaptation and advanced technology. The nearest pirate vessel, a converted bulk hauler, never had a chance. His bone blades, enhanced by vibration field generators, carved through its hull like it was mist. Internal atmosphere vented explosively, taking with it any crew too slow to reach emergency shelters. The second ship managed to raise shields, for all the good it did them. KX-117's plasma breath, hot enough to rival a star's corona, simply burned through the energy barrier. The ship's hull followed moments later, vital systems melting under the intense heat. "Is this all?" KX-117 broadcasted on an open channel, letting his disappointment color his words. "I expected better from raiders bold enough to attack a military installation." The remaining pirates responded with desperate salvos from every weapon they possessed. Energy beams, projectiles, even a few exotic weapons that might have been concerning if they'd been properly maintained. KX-117 dodged what he could and simply endured what he couldn't. His scales, already nearly impervious, had been further enhanced by the latest in material science. The few hits that got through barely left marks. The encounter. The battle lasted less than 15 minutes. When it was over, 11 of the 14 pirate vessels were expanding clouds of debris. 2 had managed to limp away into hyperspace, their crews likely already spreading tales of the monster they'd encountered. The last ship, as promised to the facility director, was disabled but intact, its crew contained in their own brig. It should have been a moment of pure triumph. Instead, KX-117 found himself nursing an injury that should have been impossible. During the final moments of the battle, one of the fleeing ships had gotten lucky. A point defense laser, something that should have been little more than an annoyance, had somehow found a gap in his defenses. The beam had struck at precisely the right angle, penetrating between his scales to damage what his species euphemistically called their soft tissue. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was concerning. His enhanced healing should have sealed it immediately. Instead, the injury continued to throb, sending uncomfortable pulses through his secondary nervous system. More worrying were the occasional flashes of cold he felt from the wound site, something that should have been impossible for his plasma-based biology. Medical attention recommended, his neural implants suggested, displaying a map of nearby facilities. Anomalous readings detected in tertiary plasma sac. KX-117 growled in irritation. The last thing he wanted was to submit himself to some frontier medical station. But his implants were insistent, highlighting a facility designated as Medical Station 7B. The station's credentials showed it was certified for Dracovian physiology, though how any non-Dracovian facility had obtained such certification was unclear. His shuttle's autopilot plotted a course while he wrestled with his pride. The station grew in his viewscreen, an unremarkable cylinder of prefab modules and hastily welded hull plates. Its medical bay was marked by the universal symbol of healing, somehow managing to look exactly the same whether you had evolved with 2 eyes or 20. Medical Station 7B to incoming vessel, a bored voice crackled over his comms. Please transmit identification and nature of medical emergency. KX-117 transmitted his credentials, already anticipating the usual reaction. The stammering, the panic, the desperate calls to superiors asking what to do with one of the most dangerous beings in known space. Instead, there was only a pause followed by, "Docking Bay 3 is clear for your approach. Dr. Chen will see you shortly." That was different. No panic, no groveling. KX-117 felt his spinal ridges twitch with mild irritation. Perhaps these frontier medics were too ignorant to even know who he was. He'd have to remedy that. The docking clamps engaged with a shudder that sent fresh waves of pain through his injury. As the airlock cycled, KX-117 prepared his most intimidating posture, head spines fully extended, plasma sacs glowing with barely contained energy. Whoever this Dr. Chen was, they were about to learn why even Admiral-grade beings requested transfers rather than face an irritated Dracovian. The airlock hissed open, and KX-117's multi-species translator picked up, whistling. Someone was actually whistling. The tune was oddly familiar, something about observing a subject. Through the airlock stepped a human in a pristine white coat, barely reaching up to KX-117's lower thoracic spines. Dr. Chen was still whistling that oddly familiar tune while reviewing something on a datapad, seemingly oblivious to the 20-foot death machine looming overhead. Fascinating wound pattern, Dr. Chen remarked without looking up. Point defense laser, correct? Mark 7 hegemony design, probably configured for anti-fighter coverage. They really should upgrade those targeting algorithms. KX-117's plasma sacs flared in surprise. How did you? The scatter pattern is quite distinctive, Dr. Chen interrupted, finally glancing up with an unnervingly cheerful smile. Now, shall we discuss your medical history, or would you prefer to continue looming? The ceiling height in Bay 3 is only 25 feet, so you might want to save your intimidation displays for somewhere more accommodating. A growl built in KX-117's primary throat. You dare speak to me with such? Yes, terrifying Dracovian warrior, scourge of 3 galaxies. I've read your file, Dr. Chen waved dismissively while typing something on the datapad. But right now, you're my patient, and my patient is bleeding plasma-enriched lymph fluid all over my nice clean floor. Examination room 4, please. It's the one with the reinforced surgical bed and radiation shielding. The revelation. For the first time in 7 solar cycles, KX-117 found himself at a loss for words. He'd encountered many reactions to his presence, terror, awe, desperate bargaining, but never this casual dismissal. The human continued typing, apparently unconcerned that a single swipe of KX-117's tail could reduce both doctor and datapad to their component atoms. Well? Dr. Chen looked up again, one eyebrow raised. Unless you'd prefer to continue leaking vital fluids while contemplating violence against your attending physician. I should warn you, the paperwork for attempted murder of medical staff is quite tedious. 3 forms in triplicate, and the Neural Compliance Division gets quite grumpy about it. Something in the human's tone made KX-117's secondary heart skip a beat. There was no fear there, no uncertainty. Just the calm certainty of someone who had seen far worse than an angry dragon and found it ultimately unimpressive. This way, please, Dr. Chen gestured toward a corridor marked with warning symbols in 17 different languages. And do mind the ceiling fixtures. The last Dracovian who knocked those down had to help reinstall them during his recovery. With a broken claw. KX-117 found his feet moving before his pride could object. The human's small frame led the way, still whistling that tune, and suddenly KX-117 remembered where he'd heard it before. It was an old war song from the human archives, something about another one biting the dust. As they entered examination room 4, KX-117 noticed something odd about the surgical tools laid out on the pristine steel tray. They weren't the standard-issue medical implements he'd seen in other facilities. These looked modified, custom-built, and was that a plasma cutter labeled for difficult patients? Now then, Dr. Chen said, snapping on gloves that seemed unnecessarily thick for routine examination. Let's see what you've managed to do to yourself. Dr. Chen circled KX-117 with the methodical precision of a predator, which was absurd given their relative sizes. The human's footsteps echoed in the too-quiet examination room, occasionally punctuated by thoughtful hums and the scratch of stylus on datapad. Your tertiary plasma gland is inflamed, Dr. Chen announced, poking a spot KX-117 hadn't even known was tender. The Dracovian warrior jerked away, his tail instinctively whipping toward the presumptuous human. The tail met empty air, Dr. Chen had already stepped aside as if anticipating the reaction. Fascinating defensive response, though completely unnecessary. Now, about that gland. No human could possibly know about. KX-117 began, letting plasma build in his primary throat sac. Third organ cluster, right side, connected to the secondary circulatory system by the xenium duct, Dr. Chen rattled off, not even looking up. Currently operating at 47% efficiency due to stress from your recent battle. The swelling is affecting your thoracic ridge mobility, which explains why you're favoring your left side. Would you like me to continue, or shall we discuss your attempt to plasma breathe in a sealed medical facility? The operation. KX-117 swallowed back the building plasma, his natural weapon suddenly feeling less reassuring. How do you know these things? I read, Dr. Chen replied cheerfully, pulling out a device that looked suspiciously like a modified mining laser. Now, this might tingle a bit. Try not to melt my equipment, the replacement forms are a nightmare. Before KX-117 could object, a beam of precisely calibrated energy struck his injured side. The pain vanished. That should have been impossible, standard medical equipment couldn't penetrate Dracovian scales, yet this human had somehow. Wondering about the tech? Dr. Chen asked, adjusting some settings with disturbing familiarity. Custom design. Had to rebuild it after my last Dracovian patient tried to eat it. Speaking of which, your fourth premolar is slightly misaligned. War wound or congenital? War wound, KX-117 answered automatically, then growled at himself for responding. He attempted to rear up to his full height, forgetting about the ceiling. His head spines scraped against the metal with an ungodly screech. Careful with the infrastructure, Dr. Chen chided, now wielding what appeared to be a repurposed plasma torch. And do try to remain still. This next part requires precision unless you want your thermal regulation system to start producing liquid nitrogen instead of plasma. Amusing side effect, but rather uncomfortable, I'm told. The casual mention of such an intimate biological detail made KX-117's scales ripple with unease. Where did you learn about our thermal regulation? Oh, here and there, Dr. Chen answered vaguely, making adjustments that sent strange sensations through KX-117's nervous system. Field experience mostly. Did you know you're the 7th Dracovian I've treated this month? Though the others were considerably more cooperative. Must be something about being a war leader that makes patients difficult. Or perhaps it's the excess plasma production that can affect judgment. KX-117 tried to process this information. 7 Dracovians. That was impossible. His species rarely sought medical attention, especially from humans, unless. Now, this next part might be a bit uncomfortable, Dr. Chen continued, pulling out something that looked like it belonged in a ship's engine room rather than a medical facility. Try to remember that attacking medical personnel is a violation of 16 different treaties. Also, the neural disruptors in the ceiling are rated for beings twice your size. Just a friendly reminder. The device hummed to life, emitting a frequency that made KX-117's secondary nervous system tingle unpleasantly. He tried to shift away, only to find his muscles responding sluggishly. Temporary paralytic field, Dr. Chen explained as if discussing the weather. Don't worry, it only affects voluntary muscle groups. Your autonomic systems will continue functioning normally. Well, mostly normally. There might be some interesting side effects in your chromatophores. Try not to be alarmed if you start glowing in patterns. The escape. As if on cue, KX-117's scales began emitting a soft purple light in waves. He wanted to roar in outrage, but his vocal cords seemed to be taking a brief vacation. Fascinating response, Dr. Chen muttered, making notes. Must remember to update the xenobiology database. Now, about that plasma gland. The scan results materialized in three-dimensional glory above the examination table, casting an eerie blue glow across Dr. Chen's suddenly serious face. The human's perpetual half-smile vanished, replaced by something that made KX-117's combat instincts scream in alarm. "Well," Dr. Chen said, voice dropping to clinical flatness that was somehow worse than anger, "it seems the point defense laser did more damage than expected. Your tertiary plasma sac has developed a microscopic rupture. It's leaking into your secondary circulatory system." KX-117 tried to process this information through the haze of the paralytic field. "That's impossible. I would be dead." "Oh, you will be in about 20 minutes, Dr. Chen was already moving, pressing buttons that made additional medical equipment emerge from previously hidden wall panels, "unless we perform immediate surgery. Computer, initiate protocol Omega-7, authorization Chen Delta 421. The examination room transformed. Panels slid away, revealing an arsenal of surgical equipment that looked more appropriate for a battleship's weapon bay than a medical facility. The lights shifted to a deep red that made KX-117's scales crawl. "What are you doing?" KX-117 demanded, finding his voice as the paralytic field began to fade. Section 47B of the Combined Species Medical Code, Dr. Chen recited while donning what looked suspiciously like modified battle armor. Life-threatening conditions override patient consent when cognitive functions may be impaired by plasma saturation of neural tissue, which, by the way, is currently at 32% and rising. The human moved with terrifying efficiency, assembling a surgical suite that seemed designed specifically for Dracovian physiology. Each instrument was custom-built, bearing modifications that spoke of intimate knowledge of their intended use. "Oh, this will hurt," Dr. Chen announced, activating a device that hummed at a frequency that made KX-117's secondary heart stutter. "A lot. The neural blockers can only do so much when working with plasma-based biology. Try not to thrash too much, the restraint field puts strain on your circulatory system." Restraint field. KX-117 tried to move and found himself held in place by invisible forces. Panic and emotion he hadn't felt since his first battle began to creep in around the edges of his consciousness. Beginning primary incision, Dr. Chen narrated to the room's recording systems. Subject's accelerated healing factor requires continuous application of molecular disruption field. Adjusting for scale density variations. The pain, when it came, was beyond anything KX-117 had experienced in centuries of combat. His roar of agony was cut short by a precision-targeted sonic pulse that temporarily paralyzed his vocal cords. "Fascinating," Dr. Chen murmured, hands moving with inhuman precision. "Your pain response indicates previously undocumented nervous system connections. Must remember to update the xenobiology database." "Ah, there's our problem." Through the haze of agony, KX-117 watched in horror as Dr. Chen manipulated his exposed plasma circulation system with the casual expertise of someone who had done this many, many times before. "The rupture has created a cascading reaction in your secondary plasma matrix," the human explained as if giving a lecture. "See these crystallization patterns? Classic sign of imminent catastrophic failure. You're lucky, 10 more minutes and we'd be cleaning you off the walls." "Well, what was left of you and the walls?" KX-117 wanted to respond, to threaten, to demand answers about how this supposedly primitive human knew things about Dracovian biology that even his own species' medical experts didn't fully understand. But all he could do was watch as Dr. Chen systematically took him apart and put him back together. The mighty Dracovian warrior, terror of 3 galaxies, did something he'd never done before. He ran. His claws screeched against the medical bay floor as he burst through the reinforced doors, sending startled medical staff diving for cover. Warning klaxons blared, but they seemed distant compared to the sound of calm footsteps behind him. Patient showing signs of postoperative confusion, Dr. Chen's voice echoed through the station's comm system, still maintaining that terrifyingly professional tone. Security protocols recommend against sudden movement after plasma matrix resequencing. Risk of internal crystallization, 47%. KX-117's memory of his escape would always remain fragmented. He remembered the cold of space as he launched his shuttle, the strange patterns still flickering across his scales, and most of all, Dr. Chen's final words over the comm. "Do come back if you experience any unusual symptoms. We have so much more to learn about your fascinating species." From that day forward, the most feared Dracovian war leader in known space developed an inexplicable aversion to medical facilities. And if his battle tactics became slightly more cautious, if he took slightly better care to avoid injury, well, that was surely just the wisdom that came with experience. Not fear. Never fear. But sometimes, in the depths of space, he would catch himself checking his scanner for medical stations. And if he detected one, he would plot his course just a little further away. Just to be safe. After all, there were much worse things in the galaxy than Dracovian warriors. Some of them wore white coats and whistled while they worked.